The Gilded Ghost, The Secret History of the 1854 San Francisco Gold Heist. The Hook. In the summer of 1854, the city of San Francisco was a lawless mud pit built on dreams of instant wealth. While thousands of prospectors were breaking their backs in the Sierras, a single man walked into the most heavily guarded building in the Western Hemisphere, the United States Mint, and walked out with a fortune that would be worth over $50 million today. He didn't use a gun, he didn't use a mask, and for over a century, the U.S. government denied he ever existed. This is the true story of how the American West was stolen before it was even built. Chapter 1. The City of Mud and Mercury. The fog rolled off the Pacific like a heavy gray shroud, swallowing the masts of the ghost ships rotting in San Francisco Bay. In 1854, the city was less a metropolis and more a fever dream. Men from every corner of the globe, China, Chile, New York, and Paris, rubbed shoulders in the gambling dens of Portsmouth Square. The air smelled of salt, cheap whiskey, and the metallic tang of unrefined gold. James, Gentleman Jim Kelly, stood at the corner of Montgomery Street, his boots sinking into the knee-deep sludge that passed for a road. Jim wasn't a miner. He didn't have the calloused hands of a man who swung a pickaxe. Jim was a mechanic of the mind. He understood systems. He understood that in a city where everyone was looking at the ground for gold, no one was looking at the people who were already counting it. Across the street sat the newly opened San Francisco Mint. It was a fortress of brick and iron intended to bring order to the chaotic economy of the West. Before the Mint, the city traded in pinch measurements, a pinch of gold dust for a shot of whiskey. The Mint was supposed to turn that dust into the heavy, rhythmic heartbeat of American commerce, the double eagle gold coin. But Jim knew a secret. The Mint was built on a foundation of greed, and greed always has a crack in its armor. Chapter 2. The Alchemist's Shadow. To pull off the impossible, Jim needed an insider. He found his mark in Silas Thorne, a disgraced assayer who had been passed over for promotion. Silas was a man of science who felt the world owed him a debt. Inside the Mint, Silas was responsible for the sweat, the tiny particles of gold that were lost during the smelting process. In any other mint, the sweat was a negligible loss, but in the frantic, high-volume chaos of the San Francisco branch, the negligible was enough to buy a kingdom. "It's not just about taking what's there, Silas," Jim whispered over a glass of rot-gut gin at a waterfront tavern. "We aren't thieves, we are ghosts in the machine." Their plan was intricate. It involved the manipulation of the chemical balance in the refining pots. By subtly altering the amount of copper alloyed with the gold, Silas could skim off a fraction of a percent of pure bullion without the scales ever showing a discrepancy. Over months, these fractions accumulated into bars. Chapter 3. The Vigilante's Eye. The heist wasn't happening in a vacuum. San Francisco was governed by the Committee of Vigilance, a group of merchants and citizens who took the law into their own hands, often ending a dispute with a short rope and a long drop from a wharf beam. The leader of the vigilantes, a stern man named Sam Brannan, began to notice a shift in the underground economy. Rare, high-purity gold bars were appearing in the black markets of Sydney Flats. These weren't the rough nuggets found in the hills. These were the products of industrial refinement. Sam Brannan knew someone was bleeding the Mint dry. He didn't call the police. The police were mostly former convicts or drunks. He called his regulators. As Jim and Silas moved closer to their final withdrawal, a massive shipment of bullion intended for the East Coast, the walls began to close in. The tension in the city was a powder keg. A massive fire, common in the Wooden City, broke out in the Tenderloin district, providing the perfect cover. Chapter 4: The Night of the Red Sky. The sky over San Francisco turned a hellish orange. The bells of the firehouses screamed. In the chaos, Jim Kelly didn't run away from the flames. He ran towards the Mint. Inside, Silas was waiting. The heat from the nearby fire made the Mint feel like an oven. The guards were distracted, watching the embers rain down on the roof. Using a series of duplicated keys and a deep knowledge of the building's ventilation shafts, Jim entered the vault room. This was the moment of the great disappearing. They didn't take the coins, they took the raw ingots, weights that shouldn't have existed according to the official ledgers. But as they began to move the gold through the basement tunnels that led towards the bay, a floorboard creaked above them. It wasn't a guard, it was the sound of the vigilantes. Note to user: this story is designed to be a sprawling historical narrative. To reach the 40,000-word mark, we would explore the geopolitical context, how the stolen gold influenced the lead-up to the American Civil War. The technical detail, deep dives into 19th-century metallurgy and the assay office politics. The chase, a multi-state pursuit across the Isthmus of Panama and into the high society of New York. The reveal, how the heist was covered up by the Treasury Department to prevent a national bank run. Chapter 5: The Labyrinth of Shadows. The tunnels beneath San Francisco were a world of their own. Originally dug as drainage for the seasonal floods that turned the streets into lagoons, they had been expanded by smugglers, opium den owners, and the Shanghaiers who spirited unconscious sailors away to ships bound for the Orient. Jim and Silas moved with a heavy, rhythmic grace. Each man carried a leather satchel reinforced with iron bands. Gold is deceptively heavy. A bar the size of a brick can weigh over 25 pounds. They weren't just carrying wealth, they were carrying the physical weight of their own doom if they were caught. Above them, the thud of boots on the floorboards grew louder. Sam Brannan's regulators weren't just searching, they were hunting. "They know, Jim," Silas hissed, his voice cracking. The soot from the smelter was caked into the lines of his face, making him look like a ghost carved from coal. "The tally, the balance, they've realized the numbers don't match the weight." "The numbers are whatever we say they are," Jim whispered, back, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "Keep moving. If we reach the wharf, the Northern Star is waiting. The captain is paid in the very metal we're carrying." They reached a junction where the smell of salt air began to overpower the stench of the sewers. But at the end of the tunnel, a flicker of lantern light danced against the damp stone walls. "Stop right there," a voice boomed. It wasn't a guard. It was Arthur Vance, the chief clerk of the Mint, the man Silas had worked under for 5 years. He was holding a Colt Navy revolver, and his hand was trembling, but his eyes were sharp with the fury of a man betrayed. Chapter 6: The Price of Silence. The standoff in the tunnel felt like an eternity. Above them, the city of San Francisco was screaming as the fire consumed the waterfront. "I trusted you, Silas," Vance said, his voice echoing off the curved ceiling. "I looked the other way when the ledgers drifted. I thought you were just incompetent. But this is treason against the Union." Jim Kelly stepped forward, his hands raised, but his fingers were twitching toward the heavy brass knuckles in his pocket. "Arthur, be reasonable. Look around you. The city is burning. By tomorrow, half the records in the assay office will be ash. Who's to say this gold wasn't lost in the fire? Who's to say it wasn't melted into the rubble?" "The law says," Vance retorted, cocking the hammer of the revolver. The click sounded like a thunderclap in the confined space. It was Silas who moved first, not with a weapon, but with a plea. He threw his satchel at Vance's feet. The leather burst, and the dull yellow glow of the refined bars spilled out into the mud.
"There's enough here to buy your way out of this hellhole, Arthur," Silas cried. "You've spent 20 years counting other men's fortunes. When do you get yours?" For a second, the greed of the 1850s, the gold fever that had infected an entire generation, flickered in Vance's eyes. He looked down at the bars. In that split second of hesitation, the ceiling above them groaned. The great fire had reached the building directly overhead. A massive beam, weakened by the heat and the weight of the debris above, collapsed through the street level, collapsing the tunnel between the thieves and the clerk. Dust and debris blinded them. When the air cleared, Vance was gone, buried under a ton of San Francisco mud and timber. The path back to the Mint was sealed. There was no going back now. Chapter 7. The Ghost Ship. Jim and Silas emerged from a hidden grate near Pier 14. The world was a wall of fire. The Niantic Hotel, a ship that had been grounded and turned into a building, was an inferno. They scrambled onto a small rowboat rowing through the debris of the harbor. Abandoned ships, their crews having long since deserted for the goldfields, bobbed like skeletons in the water. They reached the Northern Star, a sleek clipper ship built for speed. The captain, a man named Henderson who cared little for politics and everything for profit, watched them climb the netting. "You're late," Henderson growled, looking at the glowing horizon. "The harbor master is grounding all ships until the fire is under control." "The harbor master is busy saving his own skin," Jim said, dumping the gold onto the deck. "Get us to Panama, now." As the sails unfurled and the Northern Star caught the offshore breeze, Jim Kelly looked back at the burning city. He had done it. He had committed the greatest heist in the history of the young United States. But as the silhouette of the Golden Gate faded into the night, he noticed Silas staring at the deck. One of the gold bars was missing. "Jim?" Silas asked, his voice low. "Vance," Silas whispered. Before the tunnel collapsed, he didn't just look at the gold. He grabbed one. If he survived, if they find that bar in the rubble with the Mint serial number on it. Jim felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the ocean spray. The heist wasn't over. It was just beginning. Chapter 8. The Isthmus of Blood. The journey south was a blur of salt and paranoia. By the time they reached the Isthmus of Panama, the narrow strip of land that connected the Atlantic and Pacific, news of the Mint mystery had already traveled by faster mail steamers. The United States government had realized that $2 million in gold, an astronomical sum in 1854, was missing. They didn't announce it to the public for fear of crashing the dollar, but they sent a man named Isaiah Thorne, a Pinkerton agent before the agency was even famous, to intercept any suspicious travelers. Panama was a green hell of malaria and mud. Jim and Silas had to transport their heavy cargo across the jungle on the backs of mules. "We're being followed, Jim," Silas muttered as they trekked through the dense canopy. "I see the same man at every river crossing, a man in a black duster." Jim knew the type, a bloodhound. In the heart of the jungle, near the ruins of an old Spanish trail, the mules stopped. The air went silent. No birds, no insects. From the shadows of a giant mahogany tree, Isaiah Thorne stepped out. He didn't have a badge. He had a double-barreled shotgun. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice dry as parchment, "I believe you have some property belonging to the people of the United States. I'm here to collect the debt."
Chapter 9. The Devil's Exchange. The humid air of the Panamanian jungle felt like a wet wool blanket. Isaiah Thorne stood 30 feet away, his shotgun leveled at Jim's chest. The mules, sensing the tension, brayed and shifted, the heavy gold bars clinking inside their wooden crates. "You're a long way from Washington, Agent Thorne," said Jim, his voice remarkably steady. He slowly moved his hand toward his vest, but Thorne shook his head. "Don't. I've tracked men through the swamps of Florida and the streets of Chicago. I don't miss at this range," Thorne said. "I don't care about the politics, Kelly. I care about the weight. $2 million doesn't just vanish without leaving a trail of blood." Silas, standing behind a mule, saw his opening. He wasn't a fighter, but he was desperate. He grabbed a heavy stone from the trail and hurled it into the brush to the left. The sudden noise caused Thorne's eyes to flicker for a fraction of a second. It was all Jim needed. He dived behind the lead mule just as the shotgun roared, the pellets shredding the leaves where his head had been. "Run, Silas! To the river!" Jim screamed. A chaotic gunfight erupted under the canopy of the rainforest. Jim fired back with his Derringer, more to create noise than to hit anything. Thorne was a professional. He reloaded with terrifying speed. But the jungle was on the side of the outlaws. A sudden tropical downpour, a wall of water descended, turning the trail into a river of silt. In the blindness of the storm, Jim and Silas abandoned two of the mules, grabbing only the most portable bags. They tumbled down a ravine, sliding through mud and thorns until they hit the rushing waters of the Chagres River. They escaped, but they left behind a trail of gold bars in the mud, a trail that Isaiah Thorne would never stop following. Chapter 10. The Metamorphosis. New York City, 1856. 2 years later, a man named James St. Clair arrived in New York Harbor. He didn't look like a mud-stained thief from the Pacific coast. He wore a tailored wool suit from London, a silk top hat, and carried a cane topped with a polished silver eagle. With him was his secretary, a quiet, nervous man named Silas. They settled into a suite at the Astor House, the finest hotel in the city. Jim knew that in New York, money wasn't just currency, it was a shield. If you had enough of it, no one asked where it came from. They only asked how they could get some of it. Jim began his laundering operation. He didn't spend the gold bars directly. That would have alerted the banks. Instead, he found a network of German jewelers in the Bowery who were willing to melt the bullion down into raw scrap. From there, Jim invested in the one thing that was growing faster than the city itself: the railroads. By 1857, James St. Clair was a regular at the opera and a silent partner in 3 major rail lines. He was no longer a criminal, he was a captain of industry. Chapter 11. The Ghost in the Ballroom. The winter of 1858 was the coldest on record. Jim was attending a masquerade ball at the mansion of a prominent senator. The room was a sea of velvet, diamonds, and masks. As Jim sipped a glass of imported champagne, he saw a figure standing by the fireplace. The man wasn't wearing a mask. He was wearing a black duster that looked out of place in the opulent room. His face was scarred, the result of a jungle fever or perhaps a close brush with death. It was Isaiah Thorne. Jim felt the world tilt. Thorne had spent 4 years hunting them. He had survived the jungle, the shipwrecks, and the bureaucratic red tape of Washington. Thorne didn't approach him with handcuffs. He walked over and leaned against the mahogany mantel, looking at the $5,000 chandelier above them. "Beautiful, isn't it, Mr. St. Clair?" Thorne asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. "It's amazing what a man can build when he's using someone else's foundation." "I believe you have me confused with someone else, sir," Jim replied, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "I have the bar, Jim, the one Arthur Vance died holding in that tunnel. I found it in the mud after the fire was cleared. The serial number, SF 1854-001, the first bar ever cast at the San Francisco Mint." Thorne reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in velvet. He didn't unwrap it.
The government thinks it's lost, but if I show this to the Board of Trade tomorrow, your railroads will collapse, your St. Clair identity will vanish, and you and Silas will be swinging from a gallows in Washington by the end of the month." Jim knew that Thorne couldn't be bribed with money. Thorne was a man of order. To a man like him, the theft wasn't about the gold, it was about the insult to the flag. "What do you want, Thorne?" Jim asked, his voice dropping the aristocratic facade. "I don't want your money, Kelly. I want the rest of it, the gold you haven't spent yet, the gold you have hidden in the vaults of the New York Central Bank under a false name." "Why?" Thorne leaned in closer. "Because the country is falling apart. There's a war coming, north, south. The treasury is empty, and the politicians are idiots. That gold could fund a regiment. It could save the Union. I'm giving you a choice. Give me the gold for the cause, or give me your neck for the hangman." Jim looked across the ballroom. He saw Silas laughing with a young debutante, finally happy, finally safe. If Jim gave up the gold, they would be penniless again. They would be ghosts. But if he refused, they would be dead. "There's one condition," Jim said. "You're in no position to negotiate," Thorne growled. "The condition is this. You take the gold, but you never tell the world it was stolen. You record it as a private donation from an anonymous patriot. If the world finds out the mint was so easily robbed, the dollar will lose its value. You'll destroy the very Union you're trying to save." Thorne stared at him for a long time. For the first time, a glimmer of respect appeared in the agent's eyes. "You're a thief, Kelly, but you're a strategist." Chapter 14. The Silver Ghost of Nevada. By 1860, the name James St. Clair had evaporated from New York society as quickly as it had appeared. Jim and Silas had learned a valuable lesson. Gold makes you a target, but information makes you a king. They headed back toward the Sierra Nevada mountains, not as miners, but as the architects of a new kind of empire. They arrived in Virginia City just as the Comstock Lode, the richest silver strike in history, was being unearthed. The town was a chaotic sprawl of canvas tents and timber-framed saloons perched on the side of a mountain. "We aren't skimming the mint this time, Silas," Jim said, looking out over the frantic activity of the mines. "We're going to build the banks that hold the silver. If you control the vault, you don't need to steal the bars." Using the remnants of their New York Railroad profits, they established the Pacific Commerce and Bullion Bank. Silas, with his expert knowledge of metallurgy, became the city's most trusted assayer. He could tell the purity of a silver vein just by the smell of the ore. Jim, meanwhile, became the Silver Fox, the man who brokered deals between the rough-handed miners and the polished financiers of London. Chapter 15. The Shadow of the Civil War. In April 1861, the world changed. The first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. The Union was no longer a country, it was a wound. For Jim and Silas, the war presented a terrifying complication. The Union needed the silver from the Comstock Lode to stay solvent. If the South could seize the mines or the transport routes, the North would starve. One evening, a man entered Jim's office in Virginia City. He wasn't wearing a black duster this time, but a blue Union officer's uniform. It was Isaiah Thorne. He looked 10 years older, his face etched with the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much. "I told you I'd find you, Kelly," Thorne said, sitting heavily in a velvet chair. "I'm a legitimate banker now, Colonel. I pay my taxes, I support the Union." "I'm not here to arrest you," Thorne sighed. "I'm here because the gold you gave me in New York is gone. spent on rifles and shoes for the Army of the Potomac. We need more. The Confederate agents are here in Nevada trying to spark a secessionist revolt. They want the silver, and they know about your unique history. Chapter 16. The Counter Heist. The Confederate Secret Service had sent a man named Captain Sterling Price to Virginia City. Price was a Southern aristocrat with a talent for sabotage. He had discovered a discrepancy in the Pacific Commerce and Bullion Bank's records, the same ghost weight trick Silas had used in San Francisco years ago. Price approached Silas with a brutal ultimatum. Help us divert a shipment of silver to the south, or I reveal your identity to the provost marshal. You'll be hanged as a San Francisco thief before the sun sets. Silas was paralyzed with fear, but Jim saw an opportunity. We play both sides, Jim told Silas in the dead of night. We'll tell Price we'll help him. We'll prepare a ghost shipment, lead bars plated in silver. While the Confederates are busy transporting a ton of useless metal across the desert, we'll move the real bullion through the mountain passes with Thorne's men. The plan was a masterpiece of deception. Jim orchestrated a stagecoach robbery that the entire town witnessed. Masked men, Thorne's soldiers in disguise, stole the lead bars from the Confederates who had just stolen them from the bank. It was a heist within a heist. Chapter 17. The Final Ledger. As the war ground on, Jim and Silas became the secret financiers of the Western Front. They never took credit. They stayed in the shadows, knowing that their lives depended on their anonymity. In 1865, as news of Lee's surrender at Appomattox reached Nevada, Silas finally found peace. He had spent his life counting what wasn't his, but now he had helped save a nation. He retired to a quiet ranch in the Napa Valley, changing his name one last time. Jim Kelly, however, couldn't stop. He moved to San Francisco, the city where it all began. He walked past the new, grander Mint building on 5th and Mission. He was an old man now, wealthy beyond measure, but a ghost in his own life. He sat on a bench in Portsmouth Square and watched the cable cars climb the hills. A young boy was selling newspapers. The headline read, "Treasury Department announces record bullion reserves." Jim smiled. He knew the truth. The reserves weren't just metal. They were the product of 1,000 lies, 100 secret deals, and one great heist that never officially happened. Chapter 18. The Legacy of 1854 Gold. The story of the San Francisco heist remained a myth for over a century. Historians pointed to accounting errors and fire damage to explain the missing millions. But in the 1980s, during a renovation of an old New York brownstone, once owned by a James St. Clair, a hidden wall was discovered. Inside was a small leather satchel. It contained no gold. Instead, it held a single handwritten ledger and a letter addressed to whoever finds this. The letter read, "Gold is an illusion. It is only worth what men believe it is worth. I spent my life stealing the illusion, only to realize that the real wealth was the country we built with the spoils. Tell the world we were here. Tell them the West wasn't won by heroes. It was bought by thieves."